I don't know if I regret it more for what it became or for how easy it was to let it begin. Before I tell you everything, thank you for being here, for listening, without judging. If you find yourself pulled in, please hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, let me take you back to that summer, the one that changed how I saw myself, my marriage, and the color of every wall in my house. It started with peeling paint. That's how innocent it was. Our house, a modest two-story on a quiet cul-de-sac, had begun showing its age. The paint along the window frames had cracked from years of harsh sun, and the back patio wall was flaking so badly it left pale dust on your fingers if you brushed against it. My husband, Mark, had promised to repaint the place for 3 summers in a row. But between his long hours at work and his weekend golf trips, the promise faded like the color on our siding. I had stopped asking. I'd stopped expecting, really. We'd been married 12 years by then, comfortable, predictable, but quietly disconnected. Mark was a good man, I won't deny that. Reliable, practical. But somewhere along the way, his attention shifted from me to his routine's morning news, gym, spreadsheets, dinner, sleep. The kind of rhythm that kills passion softly, without a sound. I'd wake before him sometimes, just to look at his face in the dawn light. Once, that used to make me smile, remembering how he'd pull me closer in the mornings when we were newly married. Now, he just turned away, muttering something about the alarm. The silence had become normal, the absence of something intimate. That's probably why I cared so much about the walls. I told myself repainting would freshen the space, but deep down, I think I just wanted anything to change. That's how I met him. He came recommended by a neighbor. Reliable, affordable, and fast, she'd said. I didn't ask for more. When I opened the door that first morning, the sun hit him from behind, making the edges of his hair glow like a halo of copper and gold. "Hi, you must be Sarah," he said, offering a calloused hand. His voice was low, calm, confident. "I'm Daniel, here for the paint job." He couldn't have been much older than me, maybe late 30s. Broad shoulders under a faded gray t-shirt, jeans with flecks of white paint near the knees, and that kind of tan skin that comes from real work, not vacations. I shook his hand and noticed how rough it felt, but warm, firm, without trying too hard. "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "Come in, I'll show you the walls." As we walked through the house, I felt oddly self-conscious. I'd cleaned more than usual that morning, even lit a candle in the hallway, something I hadn't done for company in months. His eyes moved slowly, taking in each wall, each corner, occasionally pausing to run his hand along the surface. It wasn't flirtation, not yet, just focus. But I noticed the way he filled the space, how his presence made the air feel different. When we reached the living room, he turned to me. "You've got good bones here," he said, nodding toward the archways and high ceilings. "Just need some warmth again. Maybe a softer tone, something that feels like home, not just house." That line, "feels like home," stuck with me long after he left that day. Over the next week, Daniel worked quietly but thoroughly. Every morning at 8 sharp, he'd knock on the door, carrying his brushes and buckets, smelling faintly of sawdust and clean sweat. Sometimes he'd hum as he worked old songs, soft and unrecognizable, but oddly comforting. I told myself it was normal to bring him water or coffee, or to linger for a few minutes, asking about the progress. But then it became more than that. He started telling me stories about the old houses he'd restored, the people he'd met, about how color changes mood, how a simple cream tone can turn cold light warm, how sunlight plays differently on each shade. "People think paint's just surface," he said once, standing by the kitchen window. "But it's emotion, memory. Every wall remembers something." The way he said it made me pause. I didn't know if he was talking about walls anymore. I laughed softly. "So what do mine remember then?" He looked at me for a long second, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment, but as if he were reading something written between my words. "They remember someone who used to smile more," he said finally. My breath caught. He went back to painting as if he hadn't said anything unusual. That night, I lay awake beside Mark, staring at the ceiling. His back faced me as always, the glow from his phone lighting his profile in cold blue. I turned toward the window, where faint moonlight shimmered over the half-painted walls, still drying. I thought of Daniel's voice, his eyes, his quiet certainty and the strange warmth I'd felt when he said my walls remembered me. By the fourth day, the work had shifted from walls to trim. I offered to help, a small gesture to feel useful, to not just watch him move through my house like he owned the air. He smiled, handed me a brush, and said, "Careful. Once you start, you'll find it hard to stop. It's addictive." He was right. The smell of paint filled the room, thick but oddly pleasant. We worked side by side, not saying much, the silence soft rather than heavy. Occasionally, our arms brushed when we switched places. Once, when I dropped a brush, he bent to pick it up at the same time as I did, and our fingers met a quick, fleeting touch. But something in that brief moment made my stomach flutter. I looked up, and he was watching me not with arrogance or assumption, but curiosity, like he was wondering if I'd noticed the same charge he had. I stepped back quickly, laughing it off. "Guess I'm not cut out for this kind of work," I said, pretending to wipe my hands. "On the contrary," he replied quietly, eyes still on me. "You've got a steady hand." I didn't know what to say. The air between us felt suddenly alive, humming. Later that afternoon, he stood in the doorway holding his things. "Tomorrow's the last coat," he said. "You'll barely recognize the place." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You'll be home, right?" "Yes," I answered before I could think. He smiled, just a little. "Good. Some colors look best when someone's watching them dry." It was such a strange thing to say, but the way he said it, half serious, half teasing, left me with a warmth that lingered long after he was gone. That night, Mark came home late. He barely looked at the walls, barely looked at me. He ate dinner in silence, his phone lighting up every few minutes. "Work," he said, "always work." As I cleared the table, I saw my reflection in the window, faint, almost ghost-like, surrounded by the new color Daniel had chosen. A soft, warm beige that made the room glow even in low light. I ran my hand along the smooth wall, feeling its newness beneath my fingertips. And that's when I realized the walls might be dry tomorrow. But something inside me wasn't. Tomorrow, Daniel would be back for the last coat. And I didn't know whether I wanted him to finish or find another excuse to stay. The next morning came too soon. I woke before Mark, the sky still gray and soft outside. My body moved on autopilot, coffee brewing, dishes clinking, the quiet hum of a normal day pretending to be normal. But inside, there was a current, a nervous, restless energy that had nothing to do with paint. When Daniel knocked, it was exactly 8, as always, punctual, reliable. Except this time, I hesitated before opening the door. I looked at my reflection in the glass, hair a little looser, eyes a little more awake. My pulse fluttered, the same way it used to before first dates, back when I still believed in surprise. "Morning," he said when I opened the door, voice low but easy. "Morning," I replied, and stepped aside to let him in. He brushed past me, carrying his supplies. The faint scent of turpentine and soap trailed behind him, clean, masculine, grounding. "Last coat today," he said, glancing toward the living room. "You'll get your house back." I smiled, but it didn't reach my chest. "You make it sound like I'll miss you." He looked up from his bucket, eyes catching mine. "Will you?" The question hung there, heavier than it should have been. I didn't answer. I just turned toward the kitchen, pretending to fuss with the coffee pot. "Want a cup?" I asked. "Sure." The morning light filtered in through the kitchen blinds, slicing the air into pale gold stripes. He stood near the counter, leaning back against it as I poured 2 cups. The silence was easy again, but charged like we were both aware of the space between words. "Smells better in here," he said, nodding toward the fresh walls. "Lighter, calmer." "I think that's because the fumes are finally gone," I joked. He smiled. "Maybe, or maybe you just look different in this light." The words caught me off guard, not just because of what he said, but how gently he said it. Not like a line, more like an observation. I laughed softly, trying to diffuse it. You sound like a poet, not a painter. He tilted his head slightly. They're not that different. Both try to capture what people overlook. Something in my chest tightened. I didn't know whether it was admiration or danger. We spent most of the day in the living room again, working quietly. I tried to focus on the task, the rhythm of brushstrokes, the steady movements, the smell of fresh paint, but I couldn't help noticing the small things. The way his arm flexed as he reached overhead, how his shirt clung slightly to his back, the small streak of beige on his jaw where he must have brushed against a wall. At one point, he climbed a small ladder to reach the upper trim. I steadied it out of instinct. He looked down briefly, smiling. You don't have to hold it, he said. I'm steady. I know, I said quietly, my hand still gripping the metal. I just don't want you to fall. For a second, he didn't move. Our eyes met, his above me, mine below, and the air seemed to hum again, the faint vibration of something unsaid, something fragile and reckless. Then he looked away. Thanks, he murmured. But I've got it. I let go, my hand brushing his ankle as I stepped back. The touch was accidental. Mostly. At lunch, I made sandwiches, just something simple, because I couldn't stand the thought of him leaving to eat elsewhere. He sat at the table, forearms resting against the wood, looking around the kitchen like he was memorizing it. You really live alone here during the day, huh? He asked between bites. Yeah, Mark's always working. He's busy. Daniel nodded. You must get tired of quiet. I hesitated. Sometimes, I think I forgot how to fill it. He didn't reply. He just looked at me for a moment, long enough that I had to glance away. Then, softly, you don't strike me as the type who should be lonely. I felt the words land somewhere deep, somewhere I hadn't let anyone touch in years. By afternoon, the house looked transformed. Every corner glowed softly, the beige walls reflecting light in a way that made the air feel warmer. Daniel stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. That's it, he said quietly. Done. It should have been a relief. The job was over. The house looked beautiful. Everything was exactly as planned. So why did I feel like something was ending before it had the chance to begin? I walked around the room, fingertips grazing the smooth surface of the wall. It's perfect, I said. You did an incredible job. He smiled faintly. Glad you think so. When I turned, he was closer than I expected, just a few feet away. The air between us thickened again. Neither of us moved. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway, slow and steady. His voice was quiet when he spoke. You really do look different in this light. I swallowed hard. You said that already. I meant it both times. The space between us was so small then that I could see the flecks of color in his eyes, green, but touched with brown, like moss in sunlight. For a heartbeat, I thought he might step forward. Or maybe I wanted him to. Then his phone buzzed, sharp and loud, shattering the moment. He stepped back, exhaling through his nose. That's my brother. He needs the truck. I nodded too quickly. Of course. You should go. He packed his tools quietly. No small talk this time. I followed him to the door, trying to ignore the ache that had settled just beneath my ribs. Before leaving, he turned back once. If the paint settles unevenly, just call me, he said. Sometimes things look perfect until the light shifts. And then he was gone. The house was silent again. I walked from room to room, touching the new walls, tracing the edges where color met trim. It was beautiful, clean, alive. But it felt almost wrong, like the house was holding its breath. That night, Mark noticed the new paint for the first time. Looks nice, he said, barely glancing up from his laptop. He did good work. I waited for more. For him to see me, the hours I'd spent in that space, the conversations that had cracked something open in me. But he just turned back to his screen. Yeah, I said quietly. He did. 3 days passed before I saw Daniel again. I told myself I wouldn't, that there was no reason to. But when I found his old rag, the one he'd used to wipe his brushes tucked behind a chair, I used it as an excuse. I texted the number he'd left on his invoice. "You forgot this. Should I drop it off somewhere?" The reply came within a minute. "I can swing by later." "Around 4?" I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "Sure, I'll be home." At 4 sharp, his truck pulled into the driveway. I met him at the door, the rag folded neatly in my hand. "Thanks," he said, taking it. His fingers brushed mine, a tiny contact that sent a pulse through my arm. "You didn't have to call me over for this." "I know," I said, "but I thought maybe you'd want to see how it turned out. In the right light." He looked at me then, really looked. Then, without speaking, he stepped inside. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow over everything he'd painted. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the space, until he reached the living room. "Looks even better now," he said quietly. I stood beside him. "You think so?" He nodded. Then, without turning, he said, "It's not the walls that changed." The room felt suddenly too small, the silence too loud. When he turned to face me, I saw something in his expression, a question, a restraint, a warning. He took one step closer. "Sarah," he said softly. I should have stopped him. I should have stepped back. But he didn't. And when his hand brushed mine deliberately this time, I knew that whatever came next would change everything. I didn't pull away. Not when I should have. Not when I knew the air between us had shifted into something dangerous. His hand lingered against mine, rough skin brushing soft, and every nerve in me seemed to wake up at once as if I'd been half asleep for years. He didn't move closer right away. He just stood there, breathing slowly, waiting for me to decide what this moment was going to be. I didn't decide. My silence did it for me. When he finally lifted his gaze to mine, it wasn't a question anymore. It was a confession neither of us had spoken aloud. "Daniel." My voice cracked on his name. He hesitated, eyes searching my face for permission, for reason, maybe for guilt, but found only the truth of what had already happened inside me. Then he closed the distance between us. It wasn't a dramatic kiss, not the kind that sweeps through movies. It was hesitant at first, quiet, like a breath that had been held too long. His lips brushed mine once, then again, as if testing how far the line could bend before it broke. And when it broke completely. My hands found his shoulders, his arms wrapped around me, firm, steady, grounding. The world outside that living room fell away, the ticking clock, the hum of traffic, the neat order of a life I had so carefully built. All that existed was the pulse between us, the sound of breath mingling with heartbeat, the warmth of something that felt achingly real. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my conscience whisper, "Stop." But desire has a way of muting logic, especially when loneliness has been starving for years. When I finally stepped back, my breath was uneven, and I couldn't meet his eyes. "I can't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this." He didn't move closer again, but his voice was steady. "You already are." That truth hit harder than any accusation could. I turned toward the window, staring out at the sunlight reflecting off the neighbor's car, trying to find something ordinary to hold on to. But everything around me suddenly looked foreign, even the walls he'd painted. "I'm married," I said finally, as if saying it aloud might undo what we'd done. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to forget that." "Then what are you asking?" He took a slow breath, hands flexing at his sides. "I'm asking what you're so afraid of feeling." The question hung in the air, heavy and unfair. Because the answer wasn't him. It was me, the version of me I'd buried under routines and dinners and polite smiles. "I don't even know anymore," I said. He stepped forward again, but stopped just short of touching me. "Then maybe you should." The silence between us stretched, full of all the things we weren't supposed to say. When he finally reached for me again, it wasn't reckless. It was deliberate, slow, a pull that felt inevitable. I closed my eyes. And then for a moment, For one long heartbeat, I let go. The details blur after that. The sunlight dimmed as clouds drifted by, shadows moving across the walls like passing time. His voice was a low murmur against my skin, the sound of my name soft in the quiet. My wedding ring pressed cold against his shoulder, a reminder and a betrayal all at once. When the storm inside me finally stilled, the only sound left was the steady thud of my heart and his breath beside mine. I don't know how long we stood there before I realized what I'd done. It wasn't the kind of realization that comes with regret, not yet. It was sharper, cleaner, the sting of knowing that something had permanently shifted. There are moments you can undo, words you can take back, mistakes you can patch over. But there are others that etch themselves into the surface of your life, no matter how much paint you layer on top. This was one of them. When I finally stepped away, I felt the air rush between us, cool, almost biting. Daniel looked at me, eyes full of something I couldn't name. Not triumph, not guilt, maybe just understanding. I shouldn't have, I started. He shook his head gently. Don't say it like it was one-sided. I still shouldn't have. He exhaled slowly. You don't owe me an explanation. That made it worse somehow. His calm, his refusal to pretend this was a mistake to be erased. He reached down, picked up his rag from the counter, and slipped it into his pocket. I'll go, he said. Daniel. He turned before I could find the rest of the sentence. I wasn't trying to ruin anything, Sarah. I just saw something I couldn't ignore. The words hit me harder than his touch had. Because deep down, I knew what he meant. He'd seen the cracks, the emptiness, the woman standing inside a beautiful house, quietly fading into the background of her own life. And he had reached for her. When the door closed behind him, the silence felt different this time. Thicker, not peaceful, suffocating. I stood there for a long time, my hands still pressed to the wall where his had been earlier. The paint was dry now, smooth and cool, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But I had. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. Mark was already getting dressed for work, his tie slightly crooked. He didn't notice the distance in my voice, or maybe he did and chose not to ask. Either way, he kissed my cheek absently before leaving the same routine kiss he always gave, like clockwork. And for the first time, it didn't feel like affection. It felt like pretending. Days passed. I told myself it was over, that Daniel wouldn't come back, that I wouldn't see him again. But that kind of lie doesn't hold for long. On the fourth morning, I opened the front door to grab the mail. And there he was, standing by his truck across the street. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to look at me like that. He raised a hand in a small wave, like it was nothing, like we were just neighbors sharing a polite morning gesture. But I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the same uncertainty that mirrored my own. I should have gone inside. Instead, I stepped out onto the porch. Morning, I said, trying to sound casual. He smiled faintly. Morning. Just finished up the job down the block. Looks like you've been busy. He nodded. Trying to be. We stood there, words tangling in the air, both of us too aware of what hung unspoken between us. Finally, he said, You okay? I didn't know how to answer that. I don't know, I admitted. His expression softened. You will be. And then he got in his truck and drove away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong again, quiet in the wrong places, echoing in others. Mark snored softly beside me, his phone screen still glowing faintly on the nightstand. A text from his assistant blinked across it before the light dimmed. He didn't stir. I turned toward the wall, his wall, the one Daniel had painted first. My hand brushed against it in the dark, and I felt that same ache rise again, sharp and certain. This wasn't just about Daniel. It never had been. It was about what he'd awakened, the part of me that refused to keep living in half-light. And even though I told myself it was over, I knew, deep down, that something between us wasn't finished. Because once you've crossed the line, you can't pretend it isn't there. The next morning, his truck was parked outside again. He wasn't looking for work. He was waiting. And for the first time, I didn't know whether I was relieved or terrified. I stood at the window that morning longer than I should have. Daniel's truck was parked across the street again, the sunlight glinting off its windshield like a signal. He didn't move. Neither did I. It wasn't longing I felt now, not entirely. It was something heavier. A quiet ache mixed with fear, the kind that makes your pulse skip because you know something is about to change. Mark's footsteps came down the stairs behind me. His voice was casual, distracted. "You okay?" I turned, forcing a small smile. "Yeah. Just thinking about repainting the hallway. The color feels off." He chuckled, already scrolling through his phone. "Didn't you just paint it?" I hesitated, my throat dry. "Yeah, just thinking it might need a touch-up." He kissed my forehead, brief and automatic. "You're a perfectionist. That's why I love you." Then he was gone, car keys, briefcase, and that faint cologne he always wore lingering after him. As soon as the front door closed, I exhaled. The silence rushed back in. When I looked out again, Daniel was gone. The next few days blurred into a strange, quiet rhythm. I tried to fill the space he'd left cleaning, baking, even volunteering for a local event. But everything I did felt like running in circles, chasing the version of myself that existed before him. Because no matter how much I told myself otherwise, I kept waiting. Every sound outside made me glance toward the window. Every hum of a truck engine made my chest tighten. And then one afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard the knock. 3 short taps. The same rhythm as before. I froze. When I opened the door, he was standing there, no paint cans this time, no tools. Just him. "Hey," he said quietly. My pulse jumped. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said, "but I needed to see you." I stepped outside, closing the door halfway behind me like a shield. "Daniel." He held up his hands, cutting me off. "I'm not here to mess up your life. I just can't pretend it didn't mean something." I looked away, my voice thin. "You think I can?" His silence answered for both of us. We walked to the edge of the driveway, the late summer sun catching in his hair. For a moment, it felt almost normal, 2 people talking, not hiding. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, that you can't do this." I nodded. "But maybe," he went on, "it's not about what you can't do. Maybe it's about what you won't admit you want." That stung, because it was true. "Daniel," I started, but he interrupted, voice low and steady. "You don't have to explain. I get it. You've got a life, a husband, a home, but don't stand there and tell me you didn't feel it too." I met his gaze, and for the first time, didn't look away. "I did," I whispered. "That's the problem." He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling like it hurt. "Then what do we do?" The question hung between us, heavy and impossible. "I don't know," I said. "But whatever this is, it can't keep happening." He nodded, eyes glistening just slightly in the sunlight. "I figured you'd say that." "Then why come?" "Because I needed to hear you say it." He turned to leave, and something inside me panicked. "Daniel." He looked back. "Don't hate me," I said, voice shaking. He gave a small, sad smile. "I couldn't if I tried." Then he walked away. This time, I didn't call him back. I just stood there until his truck disappeared at the corner, the sound of the engine fading like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me anymore. That night, I dreamed about the living room again, the smell of paint, the feel of his hand guiding mine along the edge of the wall. When I woke, the sheets were tangled and my pillow was damp. Mark was already up. I heard him in the kitchen, talking softly on the phone. His tone was gentle, almost tender, a tone he hadn't used with me in months. Maybe years. When I walked in, he ended the call quickly. "Morning," he said too easily. I nodded, pretending not to notice. Maybe we were both pretending, both keeping secrets we didn't have the courage to say out loud. He handed me a mug of coffee, his smile strained. "You look tired." "Didn't sleep well," I said. He nodded, his eyes briefly flicking toward the living room. "Maybe we should get away for a weekend. Just us." The idea startled me. "You want to?" "Yeah," he said after a pause. We probably need it. Something in me wanted to say yes to let him try, to fix what was still salvageable, but another part of me, the part Daniel had touched, whispered that some things can't be repainted. Still, I nodded. Okay. He smiled, relieved. I'll book something. The weekend never happened. He got called into work. I didn't argue. By then, the silence between us had started to feel familiar again, not peaceful, but comfortable in the way denial sometimes is. And Daniel? He stayed gone. Mostly. Once, I caught sight of his truck parked near the grocery store. He didn't see me. I didn't go over. But for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that some invisible thread still connected us, stretched thin, but unbroken. I started to notice small things. The way my heart would quicken when I heard a knock, the way I'd linger a second too long by the window in the mornings. It was an obsession. It was memory, stubborn and alive. A month later, I repainted the hallway myself. Same shade, same roller. But when I ran the brush along the wall, I realized something. It wasn't about covering what we'd done. It was about claiming the space again. By the time I finished, my arms were sore and my cheeks were streaked with sweat and tears I hadn't noticed falling. I stepped back and looked at the wall. Perfect, smooth, quiet. No one would ever know. But I would. That night, I stood in the doorway of the living room, the moonlight tracing faint silver lines across the floor. Mark was upstairs, reading. I thought about Daniel, about what he said, about what I couldn't admit. Maybe I'd never see him again. Maybe that was for the best. But he had left something behind that no brush could erase. A reminder that I was still capable of wanting, of feeling, of being seen. And maybe, just maybe, that was what I needed to remember most. I turned off the lights and whispered into the dark. Goodbye. The house didn't answer, but for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't scare me. It simply was. Maybe that's how real change begins, not with grand gestures or perfect endings, but with a quiet decision to live honestly with what you've done. To stop repainting the same walls and start seeing the cracks for what they are. Proof that you've lived. So, what would you have done? Would you have opened the door that morning, or turned away? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like this one. Because sometimes the truth isn't in what we confess, it's in what we can't quite forget.